Welcome to part 3 of dialectical thinking. In this third section, we'll be carrying on from part 1 and part 2 and focusing on the real in itself, Hegel's system, and its final frontier. In this approach, we are going to be trying to identify a real without a dialectical element, the way in which Hegel's system tries to approach this real through dialectics, as well as the beyond of the dialectical system, or rather its final frontier. In order to start, we have to accept that the real we've already identified is somehow related to our own contradictions of reason and our own subjective action. This real of contradictions and subjective action brings us beyond both the reals of science and religion, collapsing them from within, and forces us to confront a beyond of both religion and science, which is not capable of accepting contradictions of reason and our subjective action as the most real. Thus, we are brought to fields outside of science and religion, like philosophy, like psychoanalysis, and like the philosophy, specifically, of existentialism. In philosophy, psychoanalysis, and existentialism, there is a similar emergent structure where truth of the one is found in its self-split into two. For example, philosophy fractures between something and nothing. Psychoanalysis fractures between eros and thanatos, and existentialism fractures between life and death. Notice in all of these structures, one of the two is empty, nothing, thanatos, and death, in relation to a series of ones, something, eros, and life. From a dialectical standpoint, the truth of the series of ones, something, eros, and life, can be found in the absence of the other, nothing, thanatos, and death. This then brings us to the real in itself, and the distinction between the real for us and the real in itself. The real in itself is experienced as rational contradictions, as our own subjective action. However, the real in itself is a pure absence. When we put the real for us and the real in itself together, we have a relationship between the subject's contradictions and a gap which is invariant and absolute. This real is the cause or the reason why the subject is constantly involved in invariant contradictions of reason. Consequently, it is not because the subject is at a distance from the truth that it finds itself in contradictions, but precisely because it is connected to the truth that it finds itself in contradictions. The truth of the real thus gains a type of temporal structure between the new and the old, whereas there is the old in itself, as well as the old for the new, as well as the new in itself, and the new for the old. The tension or the antagonism for the real in itself is the way in which the old and the new are being dialecticized by subjective contradictions and actions. This constant tension between the new and the old prevents the closure of a perfect reason that would absolutely motivate external subjective action without contradictions. And thus that means that the real in itself is not to be thought of as a positively existing independent reality, but rather as a type of self-repelling negativity that can never be filled in with positive content. This self-repelling negativity that can never be filled in with positive content brings us to the extremes that subjectivity feels in the intensity of its emotions, suffering due to the absence of the thing, as well as desire due to the impossibility of the thing. This dimension of suffering and desire is identified by many spiritual and religious traditions. For example, Buddhism, suffering and nothingness is the ultimate reality, as well as for Christianity, love and the ultimate impossible oneness in this world is the ultimate reality. In terms of our concrete experience of the real, there is always a feeling that there is always something lost in the past, the old in itself or the new for the old, or something missed in the future, the new in itself and the old for the new. This feeling is being provoked because the real is not a positive substance, but rather something empty or absent. Nothing, thanatos, death. The only real solution that the subject has in relationship to the real as an absent gap is that it has to recognize this absent gap as a positive feature. However, whether or not it is recognized as positive or negative by subjectivity, it is in itself impossible to fill, to close, etc., and also, importantly, unavoidable. One cannot get rid of it. One cannot eliminate it. The real is irreducible. Hegel's system is a phenomenological system that tries to approach this real. Hegel's system is structured in such a way as that it mobilizes negativity, the absence or the gap, as a real, death, nothingness, thanatos, and works with it in order to produce higher levels of spirit, life, something, eros. Thus, Hegel's system does not positivize an imaginal, noumenal thing, but works with the real thing in itself as contradictions of abstraction, which find their truth in concrete disintegration, opening the space for new abstraction. In order to understand how Hegel's system achieves this, we have to understand on a meta level that it is structured by three dimensions. Historical phenomenology is one spiritual process. Nothing else exists, or rather nothing is. This process is always divided into two, with one of the two being an empty lack, a self-repelling negativity, and that the reconciliation between the two is always that one of the two is empty, bringing forth a paradoxical third element. This means that the first step in the dialectic is the subject, life, something, eros, posits some presupposition, abstractions, and these abstractions get caught up in the things in themselves, which are the contradictions, the incoherence, and the oppositions of the abstractions, because the real in itself is an empty lack and not a positive substance. And then the abstractions meet their truth in concrete disintegration, the deployment of their set of potentials, which are finite, temporal, etc., and not infinite and eternal. The consequence is that the subject, as a phenomenal historical entity, is constantly caught up in generating itself in new posited presuppositions, like religion and capitalism, and whatever comes next, and then is forced to deal with the inherent negativity of these posited presuppositions, their contradictions, their incoherence, their oppositions, that are produced by the positivity of these abstractions. The critique of religion and capitalism, for example, is a negativity, and finally finds the truth of these presuppositions in their concrete dissolution, the death of religion, the formation of late capitalism, and ultimately the dissolution of capitalism, where a new system of posited presuppositions can emerge as a concrete new reality. Due to the nature of this dialectical motion involving the emergence of abstractions, posited presuppositions, and their truth in temporal dissolution, Hegel's system has a way of differentiating itself from the metaphysics of a simplistic evolutionism, which is the dominant metaphysical paradigm in the sciences today. Hegel's dialectics differentiates itself from the simplistic evolutionism in three main areas. It is synchronic, describing a system of abstraction in the present, over diachronic, describing the history of a certain system. It is constantly operating in the present, and viewing the past from the retroactive standpoint of the present, as opposed to telling us a story, a particular story of the past, and the way it informs the present. And finally, it is always already closed, necessary, and whole in itself, a present motion of abstractions, as opposed to the emergence of it, which is open, contingent, and processual, the past of abstractions. Focusing on the present moment of a certain symbolic totality leads us to three main problems or common criticisms of the Hegelian system from the point of view of individual experience that needs to be addressed internal to Hegelian dialectics of sublation. That of the problem of idealization of a totality, where an ideal is said to subsume individual experience. The fixed nature of identity of a certain totality, as opposed to focusing on its processual becoming. And finally, the indefinite survival of a certain totality under a paradigm of goal orientation or survival, fitness maximization, and so forth. In thinking sublimation, individual eros, over a type of Hegelian sublation, systemic totality, we can move from idealizing a symbolic totality to thinking positively the untotalizable element of a particular totality via individual repetition, the way in which repetition escapes any particular totalization by the ideal. This repetition prevents strict identification with a symbolic totality in identity and moves towards the transforming of a totality via the introduction of an unsublatable difference, as well as from the goal of a certain totality, the survival of it, the continuation of itself, and instead points towards the death of a certain totality, and ultimately the freedom of spirit in the dissolution of what contains it, or controls it, or holds it. And that brings us towards the end of this 3-part series on dialectical thinking. In the first part, we focused on origins of the search for truth and consequences for fundamental theory. In the second part, we focused on dialectical negativity and the beyond of both religion and science and spirit. And third, we focused on spirit's own real in itself, the way Hegel's system approaches this real, as well as its final frontier for the future of philosophy. If you enjoyed this series, please consider supporting on Patreon. I want to thank all of my current Patreon supporters for all of their help and support. If you're interested in checking out the 2 previous episodes, please click the link above. Thanks for watching.